Right, so I'm going to be talking about something I worked on for my master's thesis. It's HCASM, or Human-Centered Avalanche Susceptibility Mapping. And what this is really focusing on is shifting the emphasis of, typically we're used to looking at slope shading maps that show where an avalanche might start, but this is an attempt to show where a human's at risk in the terrain. So starting with a case study, a lot of you guys probably heard of this one. If you were here last night, you definitely heard of this one. But in 2019, there was a Silverton Avalanche School Level 2 course. So all these people had already taken a Level 1 course. Their experience backcountry tours in a avalanche safety class. This was 5 students and 1 instructor, and they were planning out their route for the day. And they pulled up this slope shading map that I'm sure we're all used to seeing, to plan a route that kept them below 30 degrees for the day. This blue line is their track, a GPS track showing where they went, and it shows that, yeah, they're staying in that yellow or no color, meaning below 30 degrees. So this is the slope they were on. That gray arrow is showing where they entered the slope. And so skier number 1 went first, that was the guide, and skier number 2 followed. Skiers 3 through 6 were still up top, maintaining eye contact and waiting for their turn. And skiers 3 through 6 actually ended up triggering an avalanche. And then this avalanche triggered a second avalanche. So at the end of both of these avalanches, skiers 3 through 6 were still up top, not buried, able to get up. Skier number 1 was partially buried, head above the snow, and able to dig out. But skier number 2 was buried beneath the debris of both avalanches over 2 meters deep. And when they were able to get him out, he didn't have a pulse and they weren't able to revive him. So this really struck the snow safety world, which is why a lot of you probably heard about this, because they were specifically in a class to avoid this happening. So this is the map that I just showed you, showing that they were staying in the yellow and no color, below 30 degrees. When CIC went to this site to do an investigation, they actually measured angles 32 to 34 degrees along this route. So this map is made from a 10-meter resolution digital elevation model. And when you make a slope layer from a digital elevation model, which is just a bunch of pixels that are saying the elevation, you're taking that pixel in the middle, and then you look at all the pixels around it and their elevation, and from that, you can get the slope. So if it's 10 meters, and then you're taking all the square around it, that's 30 meters by 30 meters. So actually, your resolution of like what you're getting from the slope is 30 times 30. So, or no, okay, math. They took a 3-meter resolution DEM and made a slope layer, and this is what it shows. So they were well within avalanche terrain that whole time, from the 10-meter to the 3-meter resolution model. So what does this tell us? Well, the first thing is placing humans at the center of these maps. So in addition to potential start zones, runouts, terrain traps, connected slopes are all really important factors to someone at risk in avalanche terrain. Number 2, providing the best quality data. So while it should be stressed that maps are one tool in a quiver of sources of information, and I really do want to stress that. Maps are just like one thing. There's loads of other things you should be accessing, like checking the forecast and taking the proper classes and having the proper gear. But it's important that map makers provide the best available data they can for decision making. And 3, incorporating uncertainty. So maps are always going to be a representation of reality. Regardless of your resolution, there's always going to be discrepancies and there's always going to be uncertainties. So that's where HCASM comes in, human-centered avalanche susceptibility mapping. So that first part, placing humans at the center. So like I said, there's those other important factors to risk besides where an avalanche might start. So one is the run out. Where's the avalanche going to go? Even if you're not in the start zone, are you still in the path? 2 terrain traps. So we really focused on 2 different types. One being cliffs or steep falls. So if you're in an avalanche above a cliff and it swipes you off the cliff, you just fell off a cliff in addition to being caught in the avalanche. And then concavities or gullies can funnel multiple paths into the same area, or they can cause your deposition to be way deeper because the avalanche goes into that gully and just builds up, making your chances of survival lower. And then finally, connected slopes. So we all are used to hearing that like 30 to 45 degrees is avalanche terrain. And yeah, generally it is. But if that prime 35-degree slope slides, it can bring the connected 26-degree slope with it. So it's still important to understand where those lower angle slopes are if they're connected to your avalanche terrain. So how did I incorporate those? This part isn't as important, so if it gets confusing, just bear with me. But for the runouts, to model a runout, first you need a start zone. So I created a grid of points based off of the width of the average size of an avalanche start zone from a CAIC database. And then from that grid, you can make circles, clip them to 28 degrees and higher, and you've got all these start zones. And you put all these overlapping start zones into, I used Ram's avalanche runout model, which is generally the most validated and accepted and popular avalanche runout model right now. And then you get a runout for every single one of those start zones. For terrain traps, there's something called a topographic position index, which basically that's taking a pixel from that same digital elevation model that you're getting slope from, and you look at the elevation of a neighborhood around it. And if that pixel is close to the mean, so that means it was either a flat slope or it could also just be an inclined slope, because yes, some are higher and some are lower. The mean's going to be about the same. If it's higher than the mean, it's a ridge, and if it's lower than the mean, it's a valley. So you can use that to pull out your gullies or concavities. And then for the steep falls or cliffs, that's just areas above 50 degrees. Connected slopes, I'll go into this a little more in a couple slides. The only thing to think or get from this is it's looking at slopes from 12 to 28 degrees, but with 25 to 28 degrees being much more likely than that 12 to 25 degrees. But I'll talk more about that in a second. So moving on to providing the best quality data. Where do avalanches occur? Slope, it's the thing we all talk about, 30 to 45 degrees generally, that's your avalanche terrain. But there's other important factors that will affect where that avalanche is going to occur. One of those is aspect. And yes, this is a really dynamic variable, and it's going to change with your season and your storms and your wind patterns. I put this into the code that creates all this as a static variable with the intention that either weather station data or forecast data can go into that and make it dynamic for the area you're looking at. Distance to ridges, you're more likely to get a start zone within 100 meters of the ridge because of cornice buildup and tension points. And then roughness or ruggedness, that's looking at the anchoring of terrain features, so sliding on a grassy slope versus a boulder field. And also propagation, but another important thing to note about this is that's another really dynamic variable. So anchoring only applies when your weak layer is below those rough features. Once again, it's in there statically, but there's a method by a Swiss guy that shows how you can have that changing with snow depth. The study area I was using was in Colorado. I'm from northern New Mexico. Generally, our weak layers are at the ground, so it would work better for us. With somewhere like here where you get more snow, you would really need that dynamic ruggedness. So don't worry too much about the flowchart. What it's saying is you put in that digital elevation model. That's where everyone's getting their slope from. That is the thing that gives you all these layers. From that, you can get your slope layer. You can get your ruggedness layer. you can get your aspect layer, and then you can get topographic position index, and then instead of pulling out the gullies for terrain traps, you pull out the ridges and then do distance to those ridges. Then you weight them. Don't worry about the numbers, but the higher the number it is, the more likely it is to cause an avalanche. These numbers were based off a pretty extensive literature review, and I'll get into those numbers later, but also can be made better. You add them all together. So this is for the start zone susceptibility layer. It's slopes 28 degrees and up, with slope still being the biggest factor, but you've got aspect, distance, ridges, and ruggedness in there. You'll see that those weightings are also really generic. Those can be adapted in the future too, but it's not good to make something like, oh, it's 0.325 if really like you need machine learning and stuff to help with that. So I kept them purposely really generic. Add that and you make your start zone susceptibility layer. If that didn't make sense, don't worry about it. I'll show you a picture and it's fine. This is all at 1 meter resolution. Connected slopes is exactly the same thing, but for the slopes from 12 to 28 degrees, with 25 to 28 degrees being much more likely. So that last step, incorporating uncertainty. This is what we're used to seeing when we look at those slope shading maps. And if you look at those categories, 30 to 31 degrees, 32 to 34 degrees, that's implying that we have that certainty to the degree, and we don't. Even with 1 meter resolution, we don't have that. So it's a false sense of certainty. You look at that and you see that hard and fast line, you're like, oh yeah, it's less than 30 right there, and it's more than 30 right there, which isn't true, necessarily. So what HCASM does is just a gradient shading. It's a better representation of what we actually know, instead of giving you that false sense of certainty. So yeah, high versus moderate, still following the same color scheme we're all used to, but it's not those hard and fast lines. And then same with the connected slope. So bringing this into a map that you can actually look at. With the HCASM, the new methodology on the left, and traditional slope shading on the right. This is that case study again. So the light blue dot is the approximate trigger location, and the darker blue line is the approximate route of the skiers. So there's your first layer. Traditional slope shading, what you're used to seeing, these are made from the same exact digital elevation model, so the underlying data is the same, versus the HCASM, which the thing to note here is the gradient shading versus that binning and hard and fast lines of the slope categories. That's how slope shading stays. That's what those maps look like. Then we add runouts, where those avalanches may be gonna go, connected slopes, and terrain traps. So with those terrain traps, the black is the steep falls or cliffs. You can't really see under them because you don't really need to. It's a cliff. The gray is that concave terrain trap. And this is not what we're used to looking at and saying like, oh, that's a gully, because that isn't a gully. What it is a bowl. And it's where multiple paths are going to be funneled to the same spot. We don't know the state of skier number 2 after that first avalanche, but what we do know is that he was buried by both avalanches. Over 2 meters deep, which I keep saying that because that's generally a cutoff in the literature. Your chances of survival go way down after 2 meters. And that, had it been only one avalanche, who knows, but at least the burial would have been less deep. So those are important factors. Looking at some real paths, courtesy of CAIC, the blue is the path, and you can see at the top of those paths are those dark reds and purples showing high start susceptibility. It's a little hard to see on this projector, but there's gray areas showing where that gets funneled. And then the peachy color at the bottom is the runouts, which are all covered. So moving forward, this is the first step, kind of a framework for where we can go from here. But there's a lot more to be done. So a really big and really important thing that needs research is, how does this affect people's perception of risk? So are they going to look at those maps and be like, too much information overload, I don't want to look at that, I just want to be able to see like my slope shading because that's what I like? Or are they going to make better decisions or more informed decisions in the backcountry? Number 2 is vegetation density. So I did not include that in my runouts or my start zone susceptibility. And that is an important factor. I was doing really extreme scenarios just to get maximum run out. But if you add in vegetation density, you can fine tune that a little more. Dynamic aspect in VRM is that ruggedness or roughness. So that can change with the snow depth at the time or the storm or forecast. A more robust, less biased ranking method. So my ranking was based off a literature review, but if you bring in machine learning into that, it can do a much better job than I can. Higher probability scenarios is applying to the runouts. So those start zones, if you looked at them, were pretty big. They were based off of pretty big ones because I wanted to get the maximum, but you can put in smaller start zones, lower fracture depths, and you can get more probable ones and then kind of have a gradient there. Validation, did the best I could with what I had, but doing this in more areas with more paths to look at, different snowpacks would be really good. Bringing this into a web application, so what you're used to like turning on and off layers like in Caltopo or Gaia or whatever app you use. And then finally making it open source. So the codes that I made to create all this are open source and free, and you can go and look at them. But they use programs that aren't. So it all uses ArcGIS, which is a paid subscription, and RAM's Avalanche runout model is also a paid service. So if ChatGPT can make it all open source for the GIS stuff now, but figuring out an open source runout model would make that part more accessible. So that's it. If you want to know more, that QR code is a story map I made. I will warn you, it's better on a computer or tablet just because the spacing gets kind of weird on your phone, but the URL at the top will also take you there. My email, there is a paper coming out about this. It's not out yet, but at some point it will be, hopefully. And then a special thanks to Mike Kuberstein from CAIC and all the CAIC people for helping get me the data that really drove this. But yeah, if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
Really good presentation, and thank you for tying in DEM resolution and hill shading we all use and slope shading. And it's a cool way to look at terrain in a different way. Your work was all done in 1 meter resolution DEMs. Mm-hmm. Have you tried running it on coarser resolution DEMs, given that the majority of our Western United States don't have such high resolution data?
I didn't do that. From the literature, anything like 5 and better is good. Actually, though, USGS is running LiDAR for the entire country, and they've got it already for a lot of places, which is where those 1 meter resolutions come from. So I don't know where they're at in the process, but probably within the next year or two, everyone should have 1 meter resolution. But yeah, I didn't, and that would be a good thing to test. The runouts, I actually should say, those were with 5 meter resolution just because my laptop couldn't handle 1 meter resolution for all those runouts. But yeah, that would be good to look at and how it changes. But hopefully everyone will have 1 meter resolution soon. So. Yeah.
You mentioned that does it change people's perception of risk? And when you look at like the graphics you showed of the 3 slide paths side by side, there's a lot of color on there and it's hard to decipher. Have you considered it as you experiment with like just pulling out the most susceptible start zones and most susceptible places to get hit or buried? Or is there a way to kind of categorize that data so it's not, even if it's less exact, it might be easier?
Yeah, I think, so I didn't do that, but I think some things that the more I look at this and the more I think about this, is a big cause for all that color is the connected slopes. And I'm not sure, I think to fully make that better, 12 is really low, and that gradient does go to clear, so those 12s are probably clear. But if you actually figured out what was connected, like within this, you can just like do it within a basin, and when aspect changes or goes over the ridge, that's not actually connected to the other one. So that could help. The more probable runouts could help. I would be worried about like choosing a start zone just because everything's so uncertain, and especially with climate change, we're seeing different patterns, and I don't have the authority, I feel like, to decide what's most susceptible, but I do think fixing those connected slopes a little more, making the runouts not like the maximum runout a lot lighter than like probable runout. But yeah, it really, I think, is just going to take handing like the slope shading maps and then the H-chasm maps to a bunch of people of a bunch of different skill levels and having them plan routes and seeing if that changes and how that changes, and then also people just trying it out in the field. But that is a big worry, is they're just going to look at that and say this is all color, it's all avalanche terrain, which in reality a lot of it is avalanche terrain. So like that's also like people don't want to see that, but they are in avalanche terrain. But yeah, that is, I think, the number one thing, is to figure out how this is going to affect decision making. Because if they're just going to see color everywhere and ignore it, then there's no point. But also being able to turn on and off layers in the web application could hopefully help with that too.
Yeah, because one of the things I think about more and more is whether I'm actually stopping in safe places, and I'm questioning more and more. And I think having some way to look at your map and be like, oh, this place is particularly vulnerable, even if it's not perfect, I can move out of it or something like that, could be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be really good to just be able to see like where's your good stopping points and rest points. Where are you not just standing under in an avalanche path, which a lot of people do. So, yeah.
Is there some thought to running Strawberry maps where people are moving through this from either a risk assessment standpoint or potentially, one other application is to be able to feed your information into this, assign some kind of risk score to that, and then actually be able to compare that to other people you're touring with from a data standpoint? Have you thought about those?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to like factor in that. There's I think it was someone in Montana did that with ski tracks, which I don't think that, or at least people I know don't really use ski tracks. I think people use Strava a lot more, but I'm sure that comes into data availability and what you can extract and stuff. But yeah, I think getting people's movements would be a huge part of that, especially with figuring out just like where are your high risk areas that everyone's walking through and stuff. Oh gosh. Okay, we'll start with you and then work our way up. Yeah.
Great presentation, Lindsey. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I guess the first question is, what snow depth did you use to initialize ramps? And how might that change? And how might your runout susceptibility change? You kind of alluded to it earlier, but if you're facing climate change.
Yeah, so I got my snow depth off of CAIC, gave me a database of all the avalanches that they had measured, and I just took the average for the max crown height. And I want to say it was 0.68 meters, I think. But that's, especially for where I was doing, that's pretty deep. And so I think changing that, and ideally you would iteratively go through quite a few snow depths. I'm not like an avalanche expert. I do maps and I like avalanche. Like I think avalanches are interesting, but like a lot of people in this room probably know a lot more about avalanches themselves than I do. But yeah, I think that was when I was doing this, I was like, dang, I'm making these huge like run out paths. But then I was like, well, that's kind of the goal right now, is to get the maximum. And then you can start doing, it was also kind of funny. So I originally I did this in Red Mountain Pass. I was also going to do it in Wolf Creek and just ran out of time because it was on a master's thesis timeline. And their patrol gave me like polygons of their paths, and they were a fraction of the size of the CAIC ones, because what CAIC is, I mean, really, like, what they're paid to do is figure out where roads are going to get messed up. So they're really looking at maximum, where Wolf Creek was looking at, like, okay, in our ski area, like, where are we going to control and stuff. So the start zone sizes, I think, were really big, too. So all of that, yeah. But I just did the average max crown height for the depth. Yeah.
Did you find any kind of correlation with the higher resolution? Did it always make the slope angle go up?
You know,
In the field, you know, say a forecaster is going to dig a pit. They're going to put their ski pole on the slope and put an inclinometer on there to get an idea of what that slope angle is. Or you're going to do a line of sight and get an average. So I don't want to say statistics can be bent, but having that higher resolution, did it make slope angles increase over the entire course of a route or something like that? So say in a legal situation where they were supposed to be on less than 30 degrees, the more resolution you have, did it increase that angle of that route?
I don't think, so I didn't specifically look at that, but just from, like, knowing how those layers are made, I wouldn't say it'll increase it, because in some places it would increase it, like you saw, but in other places it would decrease it, because when you're taking 30 times 30 is 900. When you're looking at a 900 square meter area versus the threes, like, that's a huge difference. So it just depends on your slope in your area. If you've got something that's, like, going like that, the worst resolution is going to kind of, like, get rid of that flat part, whereas the higher resolution would show that variation.
So with more resolution, could you tweak those numbers to show that that slope was steeper than it would be, when in reality no one could collect that much data when you're out there skiing in the field?
Tweak it in what way?
The more data you have, it'd be interesting to know if the slope angle always went up.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be interesting to know, and that would be a great study. I think it's just I don't think it's gonna go up everywhere. I think it would only go up some places. I actually did do a comparison where I went and took, like, 15 slope angle measurements and then extracted where that was on the DEM, and some places matched really well and others didn't match as well, and it seemed to vary, like, it could be above or below what my measurement was. So yeah.
Hey guys, sorry
Yeah.
for the
Oh.
sake of time.